Assalamu alaikum and welcome to today's session on COPI, or Community of Philosophical Inquiry. Now, there are a few questions that need to be asked before we start our session. And the first question is, what is critical thinking? The second question, how do you teach it? And thirdly, why teach it? So to answer the first question, we could probably think about theories like Bloom's taxonomy, or Edward de Bono's Six Thinking Hats, or perhaps Fassion's Six Key Thinking Skills. These are some of the theories and some of the models of critical thinking. And Fassion lists the six critical thinking skills as interpretation, analysis, evaluation, inference, explanation, and self-regulation. So each of those skills requires us to reflect deeply and to think deeply so that we understand and analyze and evaluate things. Similarly, Bloom's high order thinking skills, which are remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. So these are hierarchical in order of difficulty, where create is the most difficult thing to do and remember is the easiest thing to do. So these ideas about critical thinking need to be taught. And in education, we would probably say that nowadays learning is changing, the world is changing. And so the answer to the second question, why teach critical thinking? Perhaps the first answer would be that learners need to become more independent and less dependent on the teacher. So learner-centered learning, or constructivism, is where the students figure things out for themselves and think for themselves more. Another answer to the question, why teach critical thinking, could be to develop the four C's of 21st century learning, which are communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. If we want our students to have those skills and to develop those skills for the future, then we need to get them thinking and creating. Now, how do we teach it and why do we teach it are questions that have been asked by many people, many educators, many philosophers over the years. And a famous person or university lecturer by the name of Matthew Lipman in the 1970s at Montclair University in America, he turned his attention to developing children's thinking skills, and he pioneered a movement called Philosophy for Children, P4C. And in Philosophy for Children, or P4C, he said that in education, philosophy is essential. It's primary and it's important for children to be able to question, to think for themselves, to make decisions, and ultimately I think he hoped that children would develop wisdom and make wise decisions in their lives. So he said, and he felt that philosophy was a crucial part of education, and so he promoted this in his movement, and he actually developed his own method for doing this. And that comes to the third question, which is, how do you teach it? So how do you teach critical thinking, particularly to children? It sounds difficult, and it probably isn't something that we all have experience of, which is why you are now experiencing this session, because we want you to understand what critical thinking is, why it's important, and how you can start to teach it and think about teaching it. So the method that Matthew Lipman pioneered was called COPI, or Community of Philosophical Inquiry. And he used COPI as a method for getting children involved in discussions. The children would sit in a circle and they would make questions and they would discuss questions on issues of importance to them and interest to them. And he quite often used stories as a stimulus for this. And to quote Lipman, he said that community of inquiry consists of converting the classroom into a community of inquiry in which students listen to one another with respect, build on one another's ideas, challenge one another to supply reasons for otherwise unsupported opinions, assist each other in drawing inferences from what has been said, and seeking to identify one's own assumptions. So this sounds complicated, doesn't it? But actually it isn't so complicated. It's actually quite simple. And I would like to explain to you the 4 main steps that you require to do if you're going to do a community of inquiry in your class. So let's just list those 4 things. The first thing is that you would give the students a stimulus. And in the case of Lippmann, it would normally be a story, or what I would call a thinking story. And in that thinking story, you have questions or issues that you want the students to think about. So first step is to read the stimulus. The second step is that you ask the students to make philosophical questions, not comprehension questions. Philosophical questions are those questions that need us to think deeply and to reflect upon to get the answer. For example, what is beauty? Beauty is different things to different people. What is truth? These are philosophical questions, and in Lippmann's stories, he puts these into the stories and gets the students to discuss and think about them. So step number 2 was to make philosophical questions. Step number 3 was to categorize those questions. So the teacher, after writing down the students' questions, would look at them and see if there are any common ideas and try to group those questions into themes. And lastly, then the students would and the teacher would choose to discuss one of the questions. So let's list those again. So read a stimulus, in this case a thinking story. Students make questions, philosophical questions. Students and teachers categorize the questions into groups. And lastly, the teachers and the students choose a question to discuss. And quite often, if there are a number of questions on the board, it's often that one question will lead to another, and that sometimes you will be answering different questions when you're discussing one question because they lead on to each other. So those are the 4 steps that are required, and the conclusion really for this session is that by doing this community of inquiry, you will be practicing developing students' critical thinking skills as Bloom, Facione and de Bono advocated, and in the same time it's hoped that you will be developing the 4 C's of 21st century learning, which are communication, collaboration, creativity and critical thinking. And so if you're able to conduct a community of inquiry, then students will hopefully slowly develop those skills, practice those skills by explaining themselves, by analyzing each other's statements, by evaluating and judging what people have said and what people think, and in the end coming to a kind of conclusion about those issues and those concepts. And then I suppose possibly that could lead to better problem solving and better decision making. That is the hope, that it can be applied in their lives and in their studies so that they become critical thinkers. And in our next video, we'll be looking at a group of children involved in a community of inquiry, and I'll be asking you some questions about that. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.